For nearly 80 years, NATO operated under one basic assumption. When Europe faced danger, America would lead, America would supply, and America would dominate the alliance militarily. European countries built entire defense structures around that reality. Their air forces depended on American jets, their intelligence networks depended on American systems, and even their battlefield coordination often relied on American technology. But something is now beginning to change inside the alliance, and the shift is happening far faster than most people realize. Ironically, the trigger for this transformation may not have been Russia or China. It may have been Washington itself. Since returning to office, Donald Trump has approached NATO with a far more transactional mindset. He pushed allies aggressively to raise defense spending toward 5% of GDP, while repeatedly questioning whether the United States should automatically defend countries that, in his view, were not contributing enough. For many European governments, this created a dangerous realization. The issue was no longer whether America remained powerful. The issue was whether dependence on American military systems could eventually become a political vulnerability. That concern is now reshaping defense decisions across Europe and Canada. NATO countries are increasing military spending dramatically, but an increasing share of those billions is no longer flowing toward American defense contractors. Instead, countries are quietly diversifying toward European manufacturers and, surprisingly, toward South Korea. This shift may become one of the most important geopolitical realignments inside the Western alliance in decades. South Korea's rise in Europe's defense market has been astonishingly fast. Over the last 5 years, European NATO imports of South Korean weapons increased by roughly 130%. That growth is not happening because of ideology or diplomacy. It is happening because of industrial reality. The war in Ukraine exposed severe weaknesses in Europe's defense manufacturing capacity. European armies suddenly needed tanks, artillery systems, rockets, and ammunition at massive scale and at high speed. Traditional Western manufacturers struggled to keep up. Delivery timelines stretched for years, while prices continued rising. South Korea offered something Europe desperately needed: speed. Countries ordering systems like the K-2 Black Panther tank or K-9 self-propelled howitzer could receive deliveries in months instead of waiting several years. At the same time, Korean systems were often significantly cheaper while still meeting NATO standards. That combination changed the market almost overnight. Poland became one of the clearest examples of this shift. Warsaw signed agreements worth more than $12 billion for South Korean tanks, artillery systems, and fighter aircraft. Hundreds of K-9 howitzers are expected to enter Polish service before the decade ends, while additional agreements for K-2 tanks continue expanding. But Poland is only part of the story. Romania signed billion-dollar artillery agreements. Estonia purchased Chunmoo rocket launchers. Norway entered negotiations for similar systems. Finland expanded its Korean artillery fleet. Even France, traditionally protective of its own defense industry, began considering South Korean rocket systems instead of American HIMARS platforms. This matters because defense contracts are never simply business deals. Military procurement creates long-term political relationships. Once a country structures its military around a supplier, that relationship can shape strategy for decades. Maintenance systems, ammunition compatibility, software integration, pilot training, spare parts, and logistics chains all create dependency. Europe is now attempting to reduce the concentration of that dependency on the United States. The most symbolic example of this transition may not involve tanks or artillery at all. It may involve surveillance aircraft. For decades, NATO's airborne battlefield awareness relied heavily on the American-made Boeing E-3 AWACS platform. The aircraft became one of the alliance's most recognizable military systems, deeply integrated into NATO operations. In Washington, many assumed NATO would naturally replace it with another American system, specifically Boeing's E-7 Wedgetail. Instead, NATO moved towards Saab's GlobalEye platform from Sweden. That decision represented far more than a technical procurement choice. It reflected a growing European desire for strategic sovereignty. The GlobalEye system offered advanced radar capabilities, lower operating costs, and quicker deployment timelines. But the most important factor may have been political independence. European governments increasingly want military systems that do not depend on American approval, American software control, or American supply chains during moments of political disagreement. This fear did not emerge from nowhere. Over the years, allies watched Washington repeatedly use military access and technology as leverage. Turkey's exclusion from parts of the F-35 program after purchasing Russian S-400 systems demonstrated how quickly access could become politicized. Concerns over intelligence sharing restrictions during Middle East tensions added further anxiety. Gradually, European leaders began questioning whether true military sovereignty was possible while relying so heavily on foreign-controlled systems. As a result, Europe is now quietly attempting something historic. It is trying to build a more autonomous military-industrial ecosystem while still remaining inside NATO. The European Union's defense initiatives increasingly prioritize European-made systems and European production lines. New defense funding mechanisms worth hundreds of billions of euros are pushing procurement toward domestic manufacturers. The objective is no longer simply military expansion. The objective is industrial independence. But perhaps the most fascinating battlefield in this entire struggle is Canada. Ottawa now finds itself caught between military integration with the United States and growing pressure for strategic autonomy. In 2023, Canada committed to purchasing 88 F-35 fighter jets from Lockheed Martin to replace its aging CF-18 fleet. The deal carried massive long-term costs worth tens of billions of Canadian dollars. Initially, the purchase appeared politically settled. But after Trump's return to office and renewed trade tensions, the situation changed dramatically. Prime Minister Mark Carney's government launched a review of the broader F-35 purchase, while trade disputes over steel, aluminum, and automobiles intensified between Washington and Ottawa. Suddenly, the fighter jet deal became more than a military decision. It became economic leverage. This timing is extremely important because the USMCA trade agreement review is approaching. Canada now faces a strategic dilemma. Why should Ottawa fully commit billions toward American defense contracts while simultaneously facing tariffs and economic pressure from Washington? That question opened the door for Saab, which aggressively promoted the Gripen-E fighter as an alternative. Saab's proposal went far beyond selling aircraft. The company offered domestic assembly inside Canada, Canadian-controlled software systems, sovereign data infrastructure, and thousands of Canadian jobs. In other words, Saab framed the deal not simply as a fighter purchase, but as a sovereignty project. The contrast with the F-35 debate became politically explosive. Critics have long argued that the F-35's maintenance systems, software architecture, and logistical structure create deep dependence on the United States. Rising lifecycle costs, delayed upgrades, and operational concerns added further pressure to the debate. Then came another critical moment, when a senior NORAD commander testified before Congress that fifth-generation fighters were not strictly necessary for defending North American airspace. That statement weakened one of the strongest arguments supporting the full F-35 purchase. Now Canada appears to be intentionally slowing the process. The first group of aircraft remains under contract, but the remaining jets continue under review. That delay itself has strategic value. Every postponed decision preserves bargaining power ahead of future trade negotiations with Washington. What we are witnessing today is not the collapse of NATO. In many ways, NATO is becoming militarily stronger than before. Defense budgets are rising rapidly across Europe. Military production is expanding. Industrial investment is accelerating. But the internal balance of power inside the alliance is beginning to change. For decades, NATO functioned as a heavily American-centered military system. Europe largely accepted that arrangement because American leadership appeared stable and predictable. But today, many governments are seeking optionality. They still want the alliance, but they no longer want overwhelming dependence on a single supplier or political center. This shift could have massive long-term consequences for Washington. Defense exports are not just commercial transactions. They are instruments of geopolitical influence. Every fighter jet sale creates decades of strategic alignment. Every missile system creates long-term military integration. Every software dependency creates leverage. If Europe successfully builds a larger, independent defense ecosystem,
America's political influence inside the alliance could gradually weaken even while NATO itself survives.
The irony is remarkable. Trump demanded that NATO spend far more on defense. NATO is now spending far more than before. But an increasing share of that money is flowing toward European firms and Asian suppliers instead of American defense giants. In trying to pressure allies into greater military contribution, Washington may have unintentionally accelerated something much larger: the decentralization of Western military power itself. And if this trend continues through the next decade, historians may eventually look back on this period as the moment when NATO stopped functioning as a fully American-dominated military structure and began evolving into a far more multipolar alliance where industrial power, strategic control, and technological influence are distributed across multiple centers instead of concentrated almost entirely in Washington.